One of my earliest childhood memories is my parents, grandparents, relatives sitting around the kitchen table and telling jokes I didn't understand at all. And the reason is that they grew up in communism, and they would tell these old political jokes, which had references to all these people that I didn't know, and they also had this sense of, bitter political irony and a sense of powerlessness that I in my life couldn't quite relate to. But I have to say, over the last couple of years, as we've seen the rise of populism all around the world, as we've seen Britain vote to Brexit, as we've seen the election of Donald Trump, I started to remember some of those old jokes. So I'll tell you one of them today. It's from the Soviet Union, but it's easy to understand. A man is walking home after work late at night, and he sees another guy who's completely drunk, standing by the side of the road, throwing out his guts into the gutter. And as soon as he sees this guy, his face brightens up. He walks over, he puts a hand on his shoulder, and he says, "My dear comrade, I completely agree with your political analysis." You see, most of you in this room, most of the people watching this online, we've spent most of our lives in ordinary times. In ordinary times, the stakes of politics are high. They always are. But we have an understanding that we can figure out our disagreements through peaceful, democratic means. That if we fight for a just cause and we're defeated, then justice isn't declined forever. It might be deferred until tomorrow. But if we lose this battle, there's always another way to win the fight. And my fear is that we're now entering an era that's quite different. We've seen the election in countries which had gained their freedom when the Berlin Wall fell a few hundred years from now. They built these vibrant, imperfect, but free liberal democracies. But now in Poland and in Hungary, we've seen the election of people who've already abolished the independence of most of the country's courts, who've undermined the freedom of the media, who've brought it to a point where the opposition no longer knows whether they have a fair chance of unseating the government in the next election. In Western Europe, we see here in Germany the rise of a far-right party that's likely to be in the Bundestag, in the national parliament, for the first time since World War II. In France, Marine Le Pen didn't win the 2017 presidential elections, but she got 33% of the vote, twice as much as her father did 15 years ago. And in the United States, we now have a man in the White House who has deep and evident disregard for the most basic norms and rules of liberal democracy. Now, all of this didn't come as a complete surprise to me, because over the last few years as a political scientist, I've been working on people's attitudes towards democracy, on the deep disenchantment they have, not just with particular governments, but with the political system itself. And some of the things that I found were quite shocking. In the United States, for example, when you ask older people, born in the 1930s and 1940s, how important it is to them to live in a democracy, over 2/3 say, really important, essential. When you ask millennials, born since 1980, less than 1/3 say that it's crucial to them to live in a democracy. Even when you ask about pretty radical alternatives to democracy, there's a growing number of people who endorse those. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that they liked the idea of army rule. Today, it's 1 in 6. And it's not just about the United States. In Europe, too, support for a strongman leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections is rising. In Germany, 1 in 6 Germans believed that 20 years ago. Now it's 1 in 3. In the United Kingdom, it was 1 in 4 20 years ago. And now every second Brit says that he likes the idea of a strongman leader. So I think we need to change our understanding of the political situation we have. We're now living in extraordinary times. In extraordinary times, the stakes of politics aren't just high, they're existential. If justice is deferred today, it may be out of reach indefinitely. And if we lose the next few decisive battles, then we might lose the whole fight. So one important question is how this came about. Because to know what we do, we have to have an understanding of the causes of this populist rise. And I want to say just a little bit about that. The first is economic stagnation, and the stagnation of living standards for ordinary people. All through the history of democratic stability, we've seen a rapid increase in living standards for average people. That's no longer the case. In the United States, from 1930 to 1960, the standard of living of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. And since 1985, it's essentially been stagnant. And that really changes how people think about politics. They never loved politicians, they never completely trusted them, but they used to say, you know what, I'm doing twice as well as my parents were, my kids are going to do twice as well as me, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And now they're saying, you know what, I've worked really hard all of my life, and I don't have much to show for it, and my kids are probably going to do worse than me, so let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. The second thing is about identity. I think we underestimate the degree to which most democracies were founded on a mono-ethnic basis. In Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in France, in Italy, all of those countries claimed that they descended from a common ethnic stock when they were founded. And over the last decades, we've had lots of immigration. These societies have become a lot more pluralist. And immigrants and their descendants are now demanding equality and full inclusion in the nation. And some people are very happy about that, and they welcome that. But some people are resentful against it, and they push against it. And that's one of the drivers of this populist anger. The United States has always been multi-ethnic. They've never been mono-ethnic in the way that European nations have claimed to be. But there, too, there used to be a strict racial hierarchy. And that is also slowly being overcome. There's more racial equality. Again, there's lots of Americans who embrace that, who welcome that, who celebrate that. But there are some who push against that, who are worried about that, as we've seen tragically in places like Charlottesville over the last weeks and months. And a third big transformation, of course, is social media. Now, 5 years ago, everybody thought that Twitter and Facebook was wonderful for democracy. Now everybody thinks that Facebook and Twitter are sure to destroy democracy. I think it's more complicated than that. What they do is to close the technological gap between elites and everybody else. In some places, that's great. In a dictatorship, it gives the opposition more tools to challenge dictatorial rulers. But in democracy, it also gives hateful, extreme, xenophobic, racist voices much greater ability to influence the political system. So those are the three big causes: economic stagnation, a challenge to our identity, and the rise of social media. I think a lot more about that in my book, The People versus Democracy, but what I want to focus on today is, what can we do about all of this? How can we actually save our democracies? And the easy answer is to say, well, I don't know that we can do very much. The fire that's raging is so huge. It's going on in so many different countries. Its causes are so complicated, and each of us, what can we do? I was feeling a little disheartened about our ability to actually affect change a few weeks ago, and I happened to listen to this great talk by Amos Oz, the wonderful novelist, who was saying there is a big fire raging. That's right. And each of us only has a little spoon. And all we can do is to fill that little spoon with a little bit of water and go to the fire. And that won't do very much. If I go with my spoon to the fire, it's not going to change anything. But if all of us do that, if a whole mass of us goes and do that, then together we might actually be able to extinguish the fire. So today I want to suggest 4 ways in which you can carry that spoon, 4 things that might mean concretely in the context of liberal democracy. The first thing to do, especially in places where populists have already taken over, like in Poland or Hungary, like in the United States, is to go out and protest. One of the core claims that the populists make is that they alone stand for the people, that the real people all support them, and that anybody who disagrees with them is a traitor, they're not a real American or Pole or Hungarian. And so the best way to challenge that is to go out in the streets and show for millions of people in the public squares that no, the populists do not get to speak for us. And that's worked historically. In South Korea, last year, 2 million people came out to Seoul Plaza to protest the corrupt president. She's now in jail. The second thing we can do is a little less popular, It's to actually get involved in ordinary, boring politics, in party politics. I know from my research that a lot of young people don't like and don't trust traditional politics. But in the end, the best way to beat a populist is still to beat them at the polls. So go and join a political party. Go and campaign for a candidate you like, even if they're not perfect. And if you really can't find any candidate you like, well, go and run for office yourself. The third thing you can do is to change the kind of policies we pursue. A lot of politicians want to say there's so many big forces going on, globalization, automation, there's not much we can do. But that's not true. We can still design a set of economic policies that make sure that the bulk of economic growth actually arrives in the wallets of ordinary people. The nation state can still be open to the world and yet ensure that it helps its citizens be in control of their lives. And we can build an inclusive patriotism in which we emphasize what unites us across racial and religious lines, rather than what divides us. But we have to go and make those suggestions, do that research, and push it onto political parties. That's hard work. We need to do it. The fourth thing is in some ways most important to me. Look, all the way through the history of political thinking, from Plato to Aristotle, from Machiavelli to Rousseau, political thinkers were obsessed with the idea of educating citizens, of transmitting political virtue from one generation to the next, of explaining why we care about certain things to new generations. And this is something that in democratic societies we pay lip service to every now and again. But because we've assumed that our democracies will always be stable, that we're not in danger, we haven't taken it very seriously of late. And that's something that all of us can do. All of us can go and talk to our children, to our nieces and nephews if you don't have children. If you're a teacher, to your students. If you're a writer, to your readers. Recommit them to our basic values. Explain why liberal democracy, why individual rights and the rule of the people are ideals worth fighting for. Look, everybody's spoon is different. Everybody will want to attack different parts of a fire. None of us can accomplish much on our own. But if we all work together, we can actually go a long way towards extinguishing that fire. Now, this is sort of more or less where a normal TED Talk would end, right? I've done a little call to action. I've said something hopefully somewhat inspiring. But I want to be honest. I can't promise you a happy end. I can't promise you that everything will turn out to be great. It may be that the rise of populism is going to turn from a populist moment to a populist age, where we can't stop. And so I've been thinking a lot about a very old story, back from the Roman Empire, and it includes a senator, a philosopher, and a famous dictator, Nero. At the heart of his rule, Nero demanded a famous Roman senator to go and dance in his games, a huge humiliation, a way of showing fealty. And the senator didn't know what to do. So he went to a philosopher to ask for advice. And he said, look, if I go and partake in the game, I bring shame upon my family and I endorse Nero. But if I don't, he'll probably have my head cut off. What should I do? And he expected the philosopher to say, well, you should do the right thing. He's a philosopher, right? Of course you should do the right thing. Stand up for what's right. Don't go to the games. But the philosopher didn't say that. He said, look, the way you're asking the question, may as well go and take part in the games. And the senator was flummoxed. He said, really? So why don't you go take part in the games? What are you talking about? And the philosopher explained to say, look, once you start thinking about those kinds of things, once you start doing the sums, once you start considering, should I go, should I not go, you've already lost your character. If you ask me, is it going to have good consequences if I go? Should I rather live than die? Of course you should rather live than die. Of course pleasure is better than pain. So sure, go. I'm not even thinking about it. And I found that advice a little puzzling, that story a little puzzling, but it speaks to me in a deep way, because I think it shows that we need to commit ourselves now, while we're not yet in danger, while we can still speak up freely for our rights. We need to commit ourselves in two ways. We need to commit ourselves to make sure we never get into a situation where doing the right thing is as dangerous as it was for that senator back in Rome. And we also need to commit ourselves to the courage and the virtue that it takes in extraordinary times to stand up for the right thing in the right moment. And we need to think about that now, because if we only start thinking about it once we face real danger, it's likely going to be too late. We're going to do the sums, and we're going to be like that senator who ends up dancing in the games. So I want each of you to take a moment, if you agree with the importance of liberal democracy, or the things I've been talking about, to take a pledge, not to me, not to anybody else, to yourself, that you will start carrying that little spoon to the fire as much as you can. But even when it starts to feel dangerous to carry the spoon, even when it starts to feel futile, you'll do what you can to defend liberal democracy. Thank you.